Imagine waking up one morning to find that the US dollar, the backbone of global trade for nearly a century, is suddenly losing its shine. The savings you worked for your entire life begin to shrink in value. The cost of food, gas, and medicine starts to rise faster than anyone expected. Washington is scrambling for answers, but the world is no longer listening the way it once did. What would you feel in that moment? Fear, anger, or perhaps a sense that history has finally turned a corner? Now picture this. The spark that ignited this crisis did not come from China or Russia. It did not come from Europe or the Middle East. It came from a small, landlocked country in West Africa that many Americans could not find on a map. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of a young soldier named Ibrahim Traoré, has chosen to challenge the dollar with a weapon older than America itself: gold. For decades, the dollar has stood on a throne built not only by American strength, but also by the weakness of others. Oil, minerals, and trade across the globe were priced in dollars, giving Washington immense power. But Traoré is asking a dangerous question. What if Africa refuses to play by those rules? What if the nations of the Sahel stop selling their gold for dollars and begin valuing it in their own terms? Could a single shift in Africa shake the mighty foundations of the U.S. financial system? This is not just an economic story. It is a story about dignity, sovereignty, and the courage of a people who have been told for centuries that they are too small to matter. Now, they are daring to claim a different future. The question that lingers is chilling. Could Traoré's gold strategy truly be the beginning of the end for the dollar as the world's reserve currency? The heart of this story lies in a bold decision made in Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, stood before his people and outlined a plan that could change not only his country, but the global financial system. His words were simple, but powerful. Our gold will no longer enrich others while our children remain poor. Our gold will be the foundation of our sovereignty. Burkina Faso is not the largest gold producer in the world, but gold runs deep in its soil. For decades, international companies controlled much of this wealth. They extracted the metal, shipped it abroad, and left little behind for the local communities who worked in the mines. Families living near these mines often endured polluted water, poor health, and poverty. The gold left the country shining, while the people remained in darkness. Traoré's strategy is to change that dynamic entirely. His government has begun building state-backed refineries so that raw gold is no longer exported without being processed inside the country. Instead of watching wealth vanish across borders, Burkina Faso aims to keep a large share of profits within its own economy. The plan also includes fairer contracts for miners. Local workers will have the opportunity to sell gold directly to the state, cutting out middlemen and foreign buyers who once dictated prices. The most radical part of this strategy, however, is how the gold will be used. Traoré has signaled that Burkina Faso and its allies in Mali and Niger will begin settling trade not in US dollars, but in gold itself, or in currencies backed by gold. If this system takes hold, it could weaken the central role of the dollar in African trade. For more than half a century, the dollar has dominated because oil and other commodities were priced in it. Now Traoré is pushing for a gold bloc that could shift that balance. To the average American, this may sound abstract, but history shows how powerful such shifts can be. In 1971, President Richard Nixon cut the link between the dollar and gold. creating the fiat system we live with today. That decision allowed the dollar to dominate global trade without the discipline of a gold standard. It also gave Washington unmatched influence, because nations everywhere needed dollars to buy oil and goods. Traoré is reversing that path. By bringing gold back into the center of trade, he challenges the very foundation of dollar supremacy. The effects are already visible. In Ouagadougou, small gold sellers have begun taking their coins and nuggets directly to government offices, where they are paid fairly, and told their gold will support schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. One miner, Abdoulaye, explained that in the past, he sold his gold to foreign buyers at prices he did not understand. Now he believes his work has meaning because it strengthens his country. Regionally, Mali and Niger have joined the effort, forming what some analysts call a Sahel Gold Alliance. Together, these nations hold enough reserves to draw interest from partners like Russia, China, and India, who are eager to reduce their own dependence on the dollar. If trade deals are signed in gold, not dollars, then the demand for U.S. currency decreases. For Washington, this is not simply an African experiment. It is a potential threat to the entire financial order. International observers are split. Supporters argue that Africa finally has a chance to escape the cycle of exploitation. Critics warn that the plan is too ambitious, that Burkina Faso lacks the financial muscle to resist Western retaliation. Yet even these critics admit that the symbolism is powerful. A small nation is daring to ask why the dollar should remain king, and others are listening. At its core, Traoré's gold strategy is not just about money. It is about dignity. It is about a people deciding that their natural resources should serve their children first, not foreign investors. Whether this strategy succeeds or fails, it has already shaken assumptions that once seemed unshakable. But this raises the next pressing question. If Burkina Faso and its allies push forward with this gold strategy, how will the rest of the world react? And more importantly, what does it mean for the survival of the dollar itself? The climax of this story arrived when Ibrahim Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would begin settling regional trade in gold, not in U.S. dollars. Standing before a crowd of thousands, he raised a small gold bar in his hand and said, "This is our shield and our sword. With it, we will protect our future and no longer beg for scraps." The image spread across African media instantly. To many, it was the most defiant gesture since the end of colonial rule. The reaction from ordinary citizens was electric. In Ouagadougou, miners and shopkeepers carried small pieces of gold to government offices, eager to exchange them for local currency. They were not only trading metal for money, they were showing trust in their nation. One miner told a reporter, "Before, my gold went abroad, and I never saw it again. Now I know it stays here, building our schools and feeding our children." In the streets, young people waved signs that read, "Gold is our freedom," and "No dollar, no chains." Mali and Niger quickly followed suit, announcing similar policies. Together, the three countries began calling themselves the Sahel Gold Alliance. Suddenly, what seemed like a symbolic act by one small nation turned into a coordinated regional movement. Radio stations across West Africa carried debates about whether Ghana, Nigeria, or even South Africa might one day join the experiment. The world beyond Africa reacted with urgency. In Washington, think tanks released reports warning that if a gold-backed trade system spread, the demand for U.S. dollars could decline significantly. Analysts recalled the 1970s, when the creation of the petrodollar gave America immense power. The fear now was that the gold bloc of Africa could begin the reverse process, slowly undermining dollar dominance. A former Treasury official was quoted saying, "We cannot ignore this. If enough nations follow Traore, the dollar's role as global reserve currency will be weakened." Paris was even more alarmed. France has long maintained financial influence in West Africa through the CFA franc system. If countries began using gold directly, France's leverage would evaporate. French newspapers described Traoré as a dangerous populist who was leading the Sahel into chaos. Yet these warnings did little to slow the rising wave of African pride. Moscow and Beijing, by contrast, saw opportunity. Russian state television hailed Traoré as a hero of sovereignty. Chinese officials quietly signaled interest in supporting gold-backed projects, hinting at investments in refineries and mining equipment. For these powers, the strategy fit perfectly with their own efforts to reduce reliance on the dollar. Inside the United States, the African American community responded with a mix of hope and caution. Churches in Atlanta and Chicago held forums under the title Gold and Freedom, linking Traoré's strategy to the long history of Black struggle for dignity. Civil rights veterans saw echoes of their own battles. A retired pastor told his congregation, "As we once marched for justice in America, so now Africa marches for justice with its gold." At the same time, some community leaders worried that involvement might bring political backlash. Still, the conversation was alive, and it carried deep emotional weight. Not everyone in Burkina Faso was convinced. Opposition politicians warned that the West could retaliate with sanctions or restrictions that might cripple the economy. Business owners expressed concern about losing access to international banks. One shopkeeper said, "I support our president, but if I cannot import goods, what will I sell?" The excitement in the streets was real, but so was the uncertainty. The climax of this story is not only about a policy announcement. It is about the collision of two worlds. On one side, a small African nation demanding sovereignty through gold. On the other side, a global financial system built on the dollar. The cheers of miners in Burkina Faso and the frowns of bankers in New York reflect a single question. Can the promise of gold truly shake the foundations of the most powerful currency on earth? The answer is not yet clear, but the tension is undeniable, and the world is watching closely. The impact of Traoré's gold strategy was felt almost immediately on the streets of Burkina Faso. In the bustling markets of Ouagadougou, food prices rose as traders grew nervous about how foreign suppliers might react. Families who already struggled with limited budgets felt the pressure, and mothers worried about feeding their children. One woman named Salamata said quietly to a reporter, "I want to believe in our president's courage, but if rice and oil keep rising, how will we survive?" Her fear was real, yet it was mixed with pride. Many like her felt torn between hardship today and the promise of a better tomorrow. In rural areas, however, the story sounded different. With local refineries beginning to buy gold directly, small miners and farmers suddenly saw new opportunities. In the town of Koudougou, cooperative farmers reported that the cost of running water pumps had dropped after receiving diesel from pilot projects tied to the gold initiative. One farmer, Moussa, explained, "For the first time, my gold and my harvest are connected. I sell gold to the state, and in return, I get affordable fuel to grow food." These stories created optimism in villages, even as city dwellers faced anxiety about rising import costs. Politically, the nation entered a new era of debate. Inside Parliament, supporters of Traoré praised him as a visionary who was breaking the chains of dependency. They compared the Gold Initiative to the great independence movements of the 20th century, framing it as the second liberation of Africa. Critics, however, warned that Burkina Faso was courting disaster. Some opposition members called for urgent talks with Western partners to avoid isolation, while others demanded new elections to test whether the people truly supported such a bold gamble. On the streets, rallies became louder. Youth groups organized marches carrying banners that read, "Gold for Africa, not the dollar," and "Our wealth, our future." These gatherings drew tens of thousands, turning the city squares into theaters of pride and defiance. Yet counter-protests also emerged. Small groups demanded moderation, chanting, "Do not starve the people in the name of gold." Tension simmered, and though violence was limited, police were often called to prevent clashes. Religious leaders played an important role in calming the nation. In Friday sermons and Sunday services, imams and pastors reminded their congregations that every path to freedom carries sacrifices. They told biblical and Quranic stories of leaders who endured hardship before reaching victory. A pastor in Ouagadougou preached, "Gold will not only test our economy, it will test our faith and our patience." These words offered comfort, though many citizens still worried about daily survival. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the political ripple was unmistakable. Mali and Niger embraced the gold strategy with enthusiasm, strengthening their alliance with Traoré. Talk of creating a formal gold bloc spread quickly through the Sahel. In Ghana and Nigeria, public debates began to question whether their governments should join. Inside the African Union, tensions grew. Some leaders celebrated the defiance as a step toward continental sovereignty. Others feared that aligning with Traoré would invite sanctions and destabilize fragile economies. For ordinary families, the consequences were deeply personal. Young men who once dreamed of migrating to Europe began to reconsider. A student named Fatima explained, "If our gold can pay for schools and jobs here, then maybe I will stay. Maybe the future is not abroad, but at home." At the same time, families who relied on imported goods faced uncertainty, wondering if loyalty to the gold strategy would mean months of hardship before relief arrived. Politically, Traoré's popularity soared among loyalists. His speeches were broadcast daily, and his image filled posters across the capital. Yet opposition voices grew sharper, accusing him of dividing the nation and risking collapse. The polarization was clear. Burkina Faso had become a battleground of hope and fear, with gold at the center of every conversation. This was the new reality. A nation balancing between pride and struggle, sovereignty and vulnerability. The civil and political consequences of Traoré's gamble were unfolding in real time. But one critical question hung in the air. How would the United States and its allies respond to a gold strategy that threatened the very foundation of the dollar? In Washington, the announcement of a gold-based trade system in the Sahel set off alarm bells. At the Treasury Department, officials quietly acknowledged that if Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were able to sustain their experiment, it could inspire other nations to move away from the dollar. Think tanks began to publish reports warning that the so-called Sahel Gold Bloc could mark the first crack in the foundation of dollar supremacy. For a nation that has relied on the dollar as the world's reserve currency since World War II, the threat was not taken lightly. Memories of the 1970s oil shocks returned. Back then, long lines at gas stations showed Americans how fragile their prosperity could be when global markets shifted. Now analysts warned of a similar danger. Only this time, the weapon was not oil, but gold. One former Federal Reserve advisor stated, "If African nations successfully trade in gold, it will reduce the demand for dollars, and when demand falls, so does value." Europe responded with similar concern. France, which has long maintained economic influence in West Africa through the CFA franc, condemned Traoré's plan as reckless. European Union leaders debated sanctions, though some warned that punishing Burkina Faso might only push the Sahel closer to Russia and China. The continent was split between fear of instability and recognition that Africa's demands for dignity could no longer be ignored. Moscow and Beijing, on the other hand, wasted no time signaling support. Russian state media hailed the strategy as a historic blow to Western dominance. Chinese officials hinted at potential investment in refineries and infrastructure, suggesting that they saw the Gold Bloc as a natural partner in their wider effort to create alternatives to the dollar system. In the United States, the African American community reacted in ways that Washington could not easily dismiss. Churches and community leaders linked the Gold Initiative to struggles for justice and independence. Some saw it as an opportunity for Black America to reconnect with Africa on terms of strength rather than charity. For older Americans, the idea that small nations in Africa could influence the fate of the dollar was unsettling, but it also forced a question long avoided. How secure is America's financial throne? The stage was set. If the dollar was truly vulnerable to Traoré's strategy, the consequences would not stop in West Africa. They would reach the heart of Wall Street, the homes of American families, and the foundations of global order. Burkina Faso's decision to build its future on gold rather than dollars has set the world on edge. For some, it is an act of defiance that borders on reckless. For others, it is the long overdue correction of an unjust system that has kept Africa poor while enriching foreign powers. What cannot be denied is that a small nation has dared to question the very foundation of the global financial order. The risks are real. Sanctions could cut Burkina Faso off from critical imports. Western financial institutions could refuse to cooperate. Families already struggling with high prices could face even greater hardship. Politically, the gamble might deepen divisions at home and test the stability of the entire Sahel region. Yet the promise is equally powerful. If the gold strategy succeeds, it could transform not only Burkina Faso, but also inspire a wave of economic independence across Africa. It could also accelerate a global movement away from the dollar, reshaping the balance of power for decades to come. History reminds us that no currency holds supremacy forever. The British pound once reigned as the world's reserve, only to be replaced by the dollar after the Second World War. Today, the dollar's dominance is again being tested. The question is whether Traoré's gold experiment is a passing moment of resistance or the beginning of a long-term shift in how the world values wealth. For the miner selling gold to his government at a fair price, for the mother hoping to light her home without fear of rising costs, and for the student dreaming of building a future at home instead of abroad, this strategy is not theory. It is daily life. It is hope against fear, pride against dependency. So we end with a question that resonates far beyond Burkina Faso. Will this gold strategy be remembered as the spark that gave Africa its economic independence, or as the match that lit a global financial storm. If this story has stirred reflection in your heart, let your voice be heard. If you believe in justice, dignity, and the right of nations to chart their own path, share your thoughts and prayers. And as always, may God bless Africa, may He bless America, and may He guide the world through these uncertain times.